evening, everyone. My heart is happy because it's Youth Month. And why is it Youth Month? Why am I happy? It's a public holiday coming up, and I know we all celebrate that. Some of us sadly have to work, some don't. But it's Youth Month, and it's not a happy connotation involved in this Youth Month that we have. So I want to share a little bit about it. South Africa, we're fortunate to have a very youthful nation. However, recent unemployment figures, particularly pertaining to the youth, is major cause for concern. The 2020 fourth quarter, which isn't long ago, the Labour Force survey found that about 8.6 million young people aged between 15 and 34 years, they are not employed, and even worse, they're not even studying either, they're not being educated. And this year, 2021, marks the 44th anniversary of the 16th of June, 1976 student uprising in Soweto. And that's when young people protested against the imposition of Afrikaans by the apartheid regime as the medium for instruction. The uprising sadly ended very tragically, with hundreds of young people brutally killed. And therefore the class of 1976 became history makers, as their actions had a prominent and a profound change on the socio-political landscape of our nation. This year, National Youth Day and Youth Month will be celebrated under the theme Youth Power, Growing South Africa Together in the period of COVID-19. So the class of 1976 were history makers. The class of 2020 were history makers, as they were the first class of COVID-19. And therefore I also ask, what will the class of 2021 be? They will be history makers of some sort. And we also live on a two-way street. It's not just the youth. There's no getting away from it. Parents, communities, governments, we all have a huge role to play in the lives of our youngsters. I need to ask, what does the Bible say about our youth? Also, what does the Bible say about our social responsibility towards our youth? I've entitled this message, A Little Slave Girl. Can you imagine who this little slave girl could be? Any ideas? Well, let me take you out of your misery. Let's turn to 2 Kings chapter 5 and meet this young lady. She could also have been a young man, but in the story, she's a young lady with a very lowly profession. The chapter is entitled, Naaman is Cured. So let's read Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 15a. Luke 5. Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, was highly respected and esteemed by the king of Syria, because through Naaman the Lord had given victory to the Syrian forces. He was a great soldier, but he suffered with a dreadful skin disease. In one of these raids against Israel, the Syrians had carried off a little Israelite girl who became a servant to Naaman's wife. One day she said to her mistress, I wish that my master would go to the prophet who lives in Samaria. He would cure him of his disease. When Naaman heard of this, he went to the king and told him what the girl had said. The king said, Go to the king of Israel and take this letter to him. Remember, as a by and by, this was the king of Syria that he first went to, who now sends him to the king of Israel. It continues. So Naaman set out, taking 30 pieces of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of fine clothes. The letter that he took read, This letter will introduce my officer Naaman. I want you to cure him of his disease. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes in dismay and exclaimed, How can the king of Syria expect me to cure this man? Does he think that I am God? With the power of life and death, it's plain that he is trying to start a quarrel with me. When the prophet Elisha heard what had happened, he sent word to the king. "Why are you so upset? Send the man to me, and I'll show him that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariot and stopped at the entrance of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a servant out to tell him to go and wash himself 7 times in the river Jordan, and he would be completely cured of his disease. But Naaman left in a rage, saying, "I thought that he would at least come out to me, pray to the Lord his God, wave his hand over the diseased spot, and cure me. Besides, aren't the rivers Abana and Pharpar back in Damascus better than any river in Israel? I could have washed in them and been cured." His servants went up to him and said, "Sir, if the prophet had told you to do something difficult, you would have done it. Now why can't you just wash yourself as he said and be cured?" So Naaman went down to the Jordan, dipped himself into it 7 times as Elisha had instructed, and he was completely cured. His flesh became firm and healthy like that of a child. He returned to Elisha with all his men and said, "Now I know that there is no God but the God of Israel." Yes, 2 Kings chapter 5 is about Naaman and his leprosy. But I also believe that the major player is one of the minor characters in the story, and she is the little slave girl of whom we know almost nothing. We don't know her name, her age, or anything else. However, the one thing we know about her is that she was concerned for the people around her, even if she was their slave. And she wanted them to know the power of God. Isn't that amazing? She wanted to share God's power. She was, in actual fact, an Old Testament missionary, if you think of it. And to make the story even more amazing, it wasn't her choice. She had no free will to be where she was. She was, after all, a slave girl. But in the big but, she knew her God, and she had to do what he told her to do. Think of her. She was in a land that was not her home. She was actually there against her will. She was a slave, a war captive. Yet, she still loved the people God had placed around her, and she was willing to share what she knew about the Lord with them. When she heard that her master had leprosy, she willingly told him about God's prophet Elisha and how God worked through this man. Naaman went to Elisha because he trusted what this little maid said. Naaman, the captain of the Syrian army, trusted the words of this young lady. And that is a little maid's testimony. And if we look at Naaman, we see that he is almost condemned in a sense. Leprosy could then be likened to the big C, cancer, or even today, COVID-19. Naaman was a leper. His uniform, his title, his epaulets, his victory, nothing could save him. He had a disease that could not be cured. He was shunned by the world because of this disease. I actually wondered how his servants interacted with him. Naaman was also the little maid's enemy, as he had had her captured during a raid and took her home. But I also believe he had some wisdom, and he followed the instructions of this little maid. However, he first, like most of us, tried to do it himself. He first went to the king of Syria. This king then sent him to the king of Israel. And you know what? The king is, after all, a good place to start. Except he didn't know the real king. He also took a great deal of wealth to give away, in a sense. To me, this only proves that he was not aware of grace and mercy. He tried to do it himself with his own wealth and plenty of it, but it didn't work. So he went to Elisha, and Naaman expected Elisha to come out and see him, because after all, he was very important. But Elisha refused, which was probably the wise thing to do. Naaman was, after all, a leper. It was much like COVID. Today we have to isolate, and you don't just jump out to see anyone, no matter how important they are. You risk being infected yourself. And Naaman also thought that the prophet would put him through some ritual to make him well. He didn't want to humble himself to go to the Jordan River. And the Jordan River was known as the River of Death. And this intrigued me immensely. So I went to Dr. Google again. And this is what I learned. And I hasten to add that it makes this reading much more understandable. There's a difference between crossing the Red Sea and crossing the River Jordan. The crossing of the Red Sea was forced upon the Israelites at that time. They had no alternative but to cross because there were enemies pursuing them. But crossing the River Jordan comes out of man's willingness and is man's own choice. There are some who will not cross the River Jordan. Many do not want the power of resurrection. Paul regarded the power of resurrection as important, and he pursued it. Philippians 3 verses 10 to 12 says, "Many people have already resurrected with the Lord, yet they still do not know the power of the Lord's resurrection. Therefore, they do not have the experience of overcoming death." This is possibly why God expected Naaman to enter the Jordan River. He thought that the rivers closer to home were in actual fact superior to the Jordan, and I must admit possibly they were, except that this was not the river that God wanted him to go into. I suspect that it was his obedience that God was testing. And to crown it all, he had to dunk himself, not just once to show his willingness, but 7 times in that river. That surely was a test of obedience. But God honored this instruction he had given the little maid. He healed Naaman, and Naaman was in a sense reborn. He changed from "I thought" in verse 11 to "Behold, now I know there is a God" in verse 15. And then he gave a public testimony and declared that God is the only true God. Isn't that amazing? Now I want to ask for the youth of today, what lesson can we learn from the story? Firstly, I would say, no matter how difficult your circumstances are, even slavery, know that God is with you. Secondly, be obedient to God, whether circumstances are good or bad. We don't know what happened to the little maid, but I'm sure her circumstances changed, as her master had certainly changed as well with God's grace. Thirdly, don't look down on yourself. God has put you here for a reason. He needs you. He wants you. He loves you. Just do what he says is all I can say. And now for us senior citizens of today, what lessons can we learn from the story? Well, number 1, we cannot always profess to know it all. Yes, we are the parents of the youth, and we are called to help them grow into mature adults. And if we ignore God, what are we teaching them? Secondly, very often the youth know more than us, and I have to admit that. We need to accept that. I know I learned to see the wonder of creation from our granddaughter, who was then just barely 1. She was just almost toddling. It had started raining, and we were walking outside, so we waddled down back home. And as we passed a gutter, a downpipe, she stopped instantly and dropped down into the water. She sat there feeling it, sticking her hand up the downpipe, feeling the water, looking up at the rain, looking back at the water, feeling it, and eventually, sopping wet, we were allowed to go back home. It was a learning experience for me from a 1-year-old, a relearning experience for this grey-haired Omi. I needed to look at creation with fresh eyes. We as the seniors become very blasé. As we get older, we know it all, and that's not a positive place to be. Thirdly, I would also say that we need to hear the youth out. Imagine if Elisha, and especially Naaman, decided to ignore her counsel. Naaman would have died a leper. And as we read in Luke 4, verse 27, we see the possible choices, the outcomes that we can make. Luke says, and many lepers were in Israel at the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them were cleansed, except for Naaman the Syrian. Isn't that amazing? Only Naaman was healed because he'd heard a little girl speaking, a little slave girl. In closing, the choices we make, they do affect our future, no matter what age or stature we are in life. What choices can the youth make today? I would say the most important is to study and to do your best at no matter what you are doing. What choices can the adults make today? Well, pray for an open mind and God's guidance as we teach our children and the youth God's ways. And for all ages and statures, what can we do today? Well, firstly, never be afraid to share your testimony or to witness to others. I'm sure that little maid was quaking in her sandals at this utterly ridiculous instruction that she had to give her master. But she overcame her fear and she did it. Just imagine if she didn't do it. Naaman and his household would still be shunned, and God would not have received any glory in the situation. I believe she slept with a very grateful and peaceful heart that night, a sleep of righteousness. And secondly, we need to be aware that God calls us in different ways. Listen for his calling and act on it. And I pray that each of us will settle our hearts with God so that we can sleep the peace of righteousness. Thank you for listening. Amen.